In the remote wilderness of Maine, 3 women operated what appeared to be a religious sanctuary for over 30 years. 600 women entered seeking spiritual healing. Fewer than half ever returned home. Those who did came back changed. The Maine State Archives contained testimony from one survivor that was so disturbing, authorities refused to make it public for over a century. Tonight, we reveal what really happened behind the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. Before we continue with the story of the Convent of Eternal Tears, this channel isn't for everyone. Only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest chapters of American history. If you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of our past, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to join our community of true mystery seekers? Let's find out together. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it wasn't driven by religious fanaticism or supernatural forces, but by something far more terrifying: the calculated pursuit of knowledge at any human cost, hidden behind a facade of Christian charity. In the late 18th century, the District of Maine was still part of Massachusetts, a wilderness territory where isolated communities struggled to survive harsh winters and even harsher realities. The coastal town of Millbridge, population barely 300 souls, served as a trading post for lumber merchants and fishermen brave enough to navigate the treacherous waters of the Atlantic. 15 miles inland, through dense forest marked only by Native American hunting trails, lay a parcel of land that would become synonymous with unspeakable horrors. The Ashford women arrived in Millbridge on a gray October morning. They came in a horse-drawn wagon loaded with mysterious crates and medical supplies that drew curious glances from the townspeople. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford stepped down from the wagon with the bearing of European nobility. A striking woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked auburn hair and penetrating gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. Her voice carried the refined accent of educated English society, and her manner suggested someone accustomed to command and absolute obedience. Sister Prudence Ashford emerged next, a tall, gaunt woman with alabaster skin and hands that moved with the precise grace of a master craftsman. Her fingers were long and pale, with an unusual steadiness that would later prove essential to her gruesome work. Unlike her superior, Prudence spoke little, observing the world through pale blue eyes that revealed nothing of her thoughts. When she did speak, her voice held traces of a Scottish accent, cultured, but with an underlying coldness that made even hardened frontiersmen uncomfortable. The youngest of the trio, novice Temperance Ashford, appeared to be barely past 22 years. She possessed a haunting beauty that drew immediate attention: raven black hair, porcelain skin, and dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. But there was something unsettling about her beauty, a quality that made mothers instinctively pull their children closer when she passed. Her smile never reached her eyes, and she had an unnerving habit of studying people as if they were specimens in a collection. The Ashford women claimed to be Anglican nuns fleeing religious persecution in England, seeking to establish a new order in the American wilderness. They carried impressive letters of recommendation from English church officials, documents that would later be revealed as masterful forgeries. Their story was compelling enough to satisfy the Protestant community of Millbridge, who viewed the presence of educated religious women as a civilizing influence on their rough frontier settlement. With gold coins that seemed inexhaustible, the sisters purchased nearly 200 acres of remote forest land from a grateful widow who had struggled to pay her late husband's debts. The price they paid, 3 times the land's assessed value, raised eyebrows, but also ensured enthusiastic cooperation from local authorities. They immediately hired every available carpenter, mason, and laborer in the region to construct their religious retreat. The building that rose from the wilderness over the following 8 months was unlike any religious structure the workers had ever seen. 3 stories of gray stone quarried from the nearby coast, with walls thick enough to muffle any sound from within. The windows were unusually small and positioned high on the walls, making it impossible to see inside from ground level. Most peculiar was the basement level, which required extensive excavation and reinforced foundations far beyond what would be needed for simple storage. When questioned about the unusual architecture, Mother Superior Agatha explained with a serene smile that penitence requires solitude and solitude requires proper containment. Our sisters in England have learned that spiritual healing is most effective when the penitent is completely removed from worldly distractions. The explanation satisfied most listeners, though some of the older workers privately wondered why a house of God needed to look so much like a fortress. The Ashford women supervised every detail of construction with meticulous attention. They insisted on specific modifications that seemed strange to the builders: reinforced doors with heavy locks, drainage systems that could handle large volumes of liquid, and ventilation shafts that seemed more appropriate for a medical facility than a convent. When workers asked about these features, the sisters cited their experience with similar religious institutions in Europe, claiming these were standard accommodations for intensive spiritual counseling. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the circuit physician who traveled between frontier settlements, became one of the sisters' earliest and most enthusiastic supporters. A man in his 50s with a reputation for progressive medical thinking, drive. Hartwell was immediately impressed by the sisters' apparent knowledge of feminine psychology and mental disorders. During their first meeting, he was amazed by their sophisticated understanding of conditions that most physicians barely recognized. The sisters possess remarkable insight into the nature of feminine hysteria and melancholia, he wrote in his journal. Their methods, while unconventional, are based on sound medical principles that I fear are decades ahead of current American practice. They speak of techniques for addressing the root causes of mental disturbance rather than merely treating symptoms. What drive Hartwell didn't record in his official journal was the private conversation he had with Mother Superior Agatha about the financial arrangements for their collaboration. In exchange for referring difficult cases to the convent and providing medical supplies through his connections, drive. Hartwell would receive a substantial monthly payment and access to detailed case studies that could advance his own medical career. For a physician struggling to make a living on the frontier, it was an offer too valuable to refuse. The convent's reputation spread throughout the territory with remarkable speed. Families from settlements as far as Portsmouth, Portland, and even Boston began hearing whispered recommendations about the Ashford sisters' miraculous ability to transform troublesome women into model citizens. The cost was steep: $20 silver for a month's treatment, $50 for 3 months, and $100 for what they called complete reformation. But for desperate families dealing with scandalous daughters or hysterical wives, it seemed a small price to pay for peace and respectability. The types of women sent to the Convent of Eternal Tears reflected the social anxieties of early 19th century America. Unmarried mothers who refused to reveal their lovers' identities arrived alongside wives who had publicly challenged their husband's authority. Daughters who rejected arranged marriages were delivered to the same institution that received women who had shown too much interest in books or politics. The common thread was defiance: women who had somehow stepped outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable feminine behavior. Religious tensions of the era also played a role in the convent's clientele. Puritan families occasionally sent daughters who had shown interest in Anglican or Methodist teachings, while Anglican families disposed of daughters attracted to the emotional fervor of Baptist revival meetings. The Ashford sisters accepted all denominations with equal enthusiasm, claiming their methods transcended sectarian differences through the universal power of Christian discipline. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong at the Convent of Eternal Tears came on a bitter February night when young Thomas Brewster was hunting in the forest surrounding the mysterious institution. The trapper had been tracking a wounded deer for hours through the snow-laden wilderness when unusual sounds drew his attention toward the stone building that loomed dark against the winter sky. Thomas had grown up in these woods and knew every natural sound: the crack of ice-laden branches, the distant howl of wolves, the whisper of wind through pine needles. But what he heard that night was different, deeply wrong, and unmistakably human. Through the snow-heavy air came screaming that rose and fell in waves, sometimes dying to desperate whimpers before exploding again into raw primal shrieks of agony that made his blood freeze in his veins. Abandoning his wounded prey, Thomas crept closer to the convent, his heart pounding as the terrible sounds continued. The building appeared completely dark from the outside, but as he circled toward the rear, he noticed a faint glow emanating from basement windows that were partially hidden by snow drifts. The screaming grew louder as he approached, and with it came other sounds: the clink of metal instruments, urgent whispered conversations, and something that sounded disturbingly like sawing. Through a partially frosted basement window, Thomas glimpsed a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The basement had been converted into what could only be described as a surgical theater, brilliantly illuminated by dozens of oil lamps and candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. A woman was secured to a wooden table with leather restraints, her head held immobile by a metal apparatus that looked more like a torture device than medical equipment. Sister Prudence stood over the restrained woman, her usually pale face flushed with concentration as she manipulated what appeared to be a long, thin metal rod. The patient's head was partially shaved, revealing a pale scalp marked with dark lines drawn in ink. Most horrifying of all, there was clearly an opening in the woman's skull. Thomas could see the gleam of exposed bone and something darker underneath that he realized with sick horror was brain tissue. The screaming woman's eyes were wide with terror and pain. But what made the scene even more nightmarish was the clinical detachment of her tormentors. Mother Superior Agatha stood nearby with a notebook, calmly recording observations as if she were documenting a routine medical procedure. Novice Temperance held additional instruments, passing them to Sister Prudence with the practiced efficiency of an experienced surgical assistant. Thomas watched in frozen horror as Sister Prudence inserted the metal rod deeper into the woman's skull. The screaming reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very stones of the building, then suddenly cut off as the patient lost consciousness. The sisters continued working with methodical precision, apparently untroubled by the fact that their patient was no longer responsive to their ministrations. Unable to witness any more, Thomas fled into the night, stumbling through snowdrifts in blind panic. The image of that basement chamber burned itself into his memory. The casual efficiency of the procedures, the scientific detachment of the perpetrators, and most terrifying of all, the realization that this was clearly not the first time such horrors had occurred within those stone walls. When Thomas reached town the next morning, he burst into his father's blacksmith shop, babbling about torture chambers and brain surgery with such frantic intensity that his father feared the boy had suffered a mental breakdown. The elder Brewster, a practical man who valued community stability above all else, listened with growing alarm as his son described scenes that seemed to belong in Gothic novels rather than a respectable religious institution. "Thomas," his father said carefully, "you were hunting alone in a blizzard in the dark after tracking a wounded animal for hours. The mind can play terrible tricks under such circumstances. Perhaps what you saw was a medical procedure of some kind. The sisters are known to treat various feminine ailments that require intimate intervention." But Thomas's description was too detailed, too specific to be dismissed as hallucination or misunderstanding. He could describe the layout of the basement chamber, the specific instruments he had observed, and most convincingly, the clinical manner in which the procedures were being conducted. This wasn't the random violence of madness, but something far more sinister, systematic, methodical, and clearly practiced. The elder Brewster decided to consult with Deacon Morrison, the town's most respected citizen and unofficial moral authority. Morrison was a cautious man who had built his reputation on careful judgment and community harmony. The Ashford sisters had been model citizens for 5 years, contributing generously to local charities and maintaining perfect decorum in their rare public appearances. More importantly, several prominent families currently had daughters and wives receiving treatment at the convent. "We must be extremely careful," Deacon Morrison warned after hearing Thomas's account. "Accusations of this nature could destroy reputations and tear our community apart. These are respected women of God, not common criminals. There must be a reasonable explanation for what the boy thinks he saw." However, the deacon was too responsible to ignore such serious allegations entirely. He agreed to make a discreet inquiry, visiting the convent the following week under the pretense of discussing a church fundraising event that would require the sisters' participation. Mother Superior Agatha received him in the convent's austere parlor, a sparsely furnished room dominated by a large wooden crucifix and religious paintings that seemed to watch visitors with judgmental eyes. Her manner was perfectly gracious and composed, showing no sign of anxiety or guilt as she served tea and inquired about his family's health with apparent genuine concern. When Deacon Morrison delicately mentioned that local hunters had reported unusual noises coming from the convent at night, Mother Superior Agatha's expression showed only mild concern and understanding. "Deacon Morrison," she said in her cultured English accent, "we often conduct intensive prayer sessions for our most troubled residents during the quiet hours of night. The process of spiritual cleansing can be quite vocal, particularly for women who have lived lives of sin and moral corruption." She explained that many of their patients arrived in states of severe spiritual distress, possessed by demons of pride, lust, and rebellion that fought desperately against the purifying power of Christian discipline. Some women, She continued with sympathetic sadness, have allowed evil to take such deep root in their souls that the process of extraction requires considerable effort. The sounds your hunters heard were likely the cries of demons being cast out through the power of prayer and penance. The explanation was delivered with such sincerity and theological sophistication that Deacon Morrison found himself nodding in agreement. The concept of spiritual warfare was familiar to all frontier Christians, and the idea that particularly corrupted souls might require extreme measures for their salvation was not unreasonable within the religious context of the era. Mother Superior Agatha then offered to show him through the upper levels of the convent, leading him through Spartan but clean dormitory rooms where several women sat in silent contemplation. The residents appeared calm and deeply absorbed in prayer or meditation, though Deacon Morrison noticed they seemed unusually subdued, moving with mechanical precision rather than natural human spontaneity. When he attempted to make eye contact with them, they seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if their attention was focused on something invisible in the distance. When the deacon asked about visiting the basement levels, Mother Superior Agatha explained that they served as the convent's intensive spiritual counseling facilities for women requiring the most focused attention. "I'm afraid it would be inappropriate for a man to witness such intimate procedures," she said with a modest smile. "Some of our treatments for feminine spiritual corruption require private examination of the soul that would compromise the patient's dignity if observed by male eyes." The explanation seemed reasonable within the social conventions of the time, and Deacon Morrison left the convent feeling reassured that Thomas Brewster had indeed misinterpreted what he had witnessed. However, something continued to trouble him during the ride home. A subtle wrongness that he couldn't quite identify, but couldn't shake from his thoughts. The women he had observed seemed too quiet, too controlled, moving with an unnatural uniformity that suggested not peace, but something else entirely,